Hello again. If you're watching this video, you've just finished reading Chapter 1 in Mindscapes. Hey, there was a lot of good information in there, wasn't there? Take a minute and think, how much do you remember? Sometimes during reading, we get a good idea, a good general idea of what we've read. But just reading it is not enough to make it really stick in our brains. It's not enough to make sure that we comprehend and remember all the important information. So what should you as a college student do when you study a textbook chapter? Well, a lot of holistic reading strategies have been designed. Holistic means they include before, during, and after reading steps designed to help you read and remember difficult information. Chapter 1 introduced you to many different types of holistic reading strategies. And today we're going to take a deeper look at the strategy called SQ3R. So Dr. Carter, gives a real quick look at that strategy, but she doesn't really explain it in depth. We're going to be using SQ3R to form a study guide for Chapter 1, and again to form another study guide for Chapter 2. So I'd like to take a look at where this strategy comes from, how it was developed, and also take a deeper dive into how to do it. This is all in preparation for your study guide for Chapter 1, and then later on, your study guide for Chapter 2. So where did it come from? Well, it's kind of interesting history. So right at the beginning of World War II, a lot of young men were joining the armed forces. And they went through, of course, basic training, but beyond basic training, different soldiers were assigned to different jobs. And they needed to learn stuff to do those jobs. And so the armed services printed manuals and textbooks to teach them what they needed to know. And Dr. Francis Robinson of Ohio State University was in charge of teaching young soldiers information they needed to learn for their jobs. And he found that he was teaching all different kinds of learners, people who are really strong at reading, but also people who maybe even dropped out of high school or had limited reading abilities. And so he really had to think of a way to read textbooks that would work for everyone. And he came up with this method, which he called SQ3R. Well, it didn't go away at the end of World War II, and in fact, it's been used widely in colleges and universities since then. It's called the father of all reading methods, and it's still an effective study method today in the technological age. SQ3R is what we call an acronym. In other words, each one of the letters, SQRRR, stands for a step in the strategy. The steps take you before, during, and after the reading process. Let's take a look at the steps here. S for survey, Q for question, R for read, R for recite, and R for review. And then the book also mentions there's another version of the strategy called SQ4R. And if you're doing SQ4R, then you move on to another R called reflect. Survey. Survey, just like a surveyor looks over land before he makes a map, you should look over a chapter before you start to read. Read all the titles, all the subtitles, and all the headings. But don't stop to read the individual sentences and paragraphs. Take a quick look at all the visual aids, such as charts, tables, graphs, and pictures. This is a pre-reading strategy that gives you a good overview of what you're going to learn. And it also helps you to see how the different parts of the chapter fit together. So that was S. Next comes Q. Q is question. When you question, you ask one or more questions for each section of the chapter, with the idea that after you read the section more thoroughly, you're going to answer that question. Let me give you a very quick sample from chapter 1. After the pre-assessment, you find a section called How You Learn. You can turn that into a question saying, how do I learn? The next subheading is called metacognition. To me, that question would then be, what is metacognition? Or maybe even two questions. What is metacognition, and how does it help me learn? In the SQ3R strategy or the 3R strategy, you continue on asking a question formed from each of the titles or subtitles. Next, you go on to the R, my favorite, read, because I love reading, and you read the chapter section by section. So going back to that first section, how you learn, I turned it into the question, how do I learn? And after reading that section, I'm going to try to R, the second R, recite. Or in other words, explain what I learned in my own words. So I'm going to put it in my own way and explain how I learn according to the textbook, according to what I just read. Now, for your study guide for chapter 1, you'll be doing the S, Q, and the first two R's. But just to continue on with my explanation of SQ3R, the next step, review, would be where you study. You study over time. So maybe after you've finished your SQ and your first two R's, the next day, you go through and you cover up the answers to your questions, and you just look at the questions. You try to answer them from memory. If you can, you move on to the next question. If you can't, you go back and reread what you wrote down under recite. And you continue on, and then maybe you continue to review until you feel like you've not only learned, but you've overlearned that material. And then you'd be ready to take a test from memory. SQ3R has a final R step, which is after you take the test over the chapter. And that's, you think about, how well did SQ3R work for me? What didn't work? How should I modify the strategy to make it work? So those are the steps in the strategy explained. Let's talk a little bit more about how you make an SQ3R study guide. Well, for chapter 1, the study guide is started for you. The S and the Q are done. There's two attachments. You just open up one, and in the first attachment, you will see, in the attachment for Chapter 1, you will see all those titles and subtitles and the questions already done. So your job is going to be to read section by section, looking for the answer to the questions, and then writing the answers to your questions in your own words. And that'll be what you turn in as your SQ3R study guide. Because we're not being tested over the content of Chapter 1, you don't need to review. Then for Chapter 2, we'll do an SQ3R study guide again. But this time, there won't be a document that'll start you out. You'll open up a blank document and you'll write the titles, subtitles, and headings yourself. You'll turn each into a question. You'll read, and then you'll write the answers to the questions in your own words. Again, you don't need to review Chapter 2 because you won't be tested over Chapter 2 either. So I bet I know what you're thinking. Well, what about the unit test? There's a unit test for Chapters 1 and 2. What do you mean I won't be tested over Chapters 1 and 2? Well, the unit test does not cover the content of those chapters. Instead, it's going to ask questions from the applications sections that come at the ends of Chapters 1 and 2. But more about that later. I'll come talk to you again before you take the unit test. For now, go ahead and go to the Chapter 1 study guide, open it up, and start on the SQ3R process. I think you'll be excited to see how much you can learn and remember using this strategy. Goodbye for now.